I've made an argument that tribes have significant leverage now, both at a political level, economic level, and we should be using that leverage to start to shape conversations around foreign policy. And with the significant changes which you've sort of alluded to and the political shifts going on, which are profound, we should be starting to engage in conversations about that and shaping that.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Professor Garrick Cooper. Garrick is an associate professor at the Aotahi School of Maori and Indigenous Studies at Canterbury University in Christchurch, New Zealand. Garrick studies decoloniality, which includes understanding the ways in which coloniality reproduces and sustains itself and maintains the interests of dominant groups in society and how we might subvert those processes. The many ways in which coloniality still dominates the contemporary world in New Zealand and beyond is what we want to talk about today. So, Garrick, welcome.
Tēnā koe Pascal, and tēnā koutou nā kai whakarongo te hongo e whakarongo mai nā tēnā koutou.
I
Thank you
wish
for
I
that.
understood what you just said.
It was very brief. I just said hello and greetings to your listeners.
It's very nice to hear Indigenous Maori language. Um,
Mm,
I will ask you about the Maori in just a moment, and
mm,
that's your people, right? You're
mhm,
I mean, you're a Maori, and
mhm.
um, I would like to start though with your studies, how I introduced you, because the term coloniality and decoloniality was new to me until I luckily ran into you, because
Mm.
I think of things as colonization and decolonization. Could you maybe
Yeah,
start by explaining how these terms differ and why you go for decoloniality and not decolonization?
yeah, sure. So there are the term coloniality and decoloniality really came out of a body of work from some Caribbean and Latin American scholars. Sort of early 2000s. And the sort of one of the distinctions that they make between the two is they talk about coloniality as a sort of artifact of formal colonization and the sort of power and relationships that exist once a formal colonization has ceased. Sometimes the colonizers leave, sometimes they don't. But certainly the set of relationships that were set up in that formal colonial period maintain themselves. So coloniality is really to sort of put a name to their ongoing set of relationships established in that formal colonial period. The decolonial scholars or decoloniality scholars also talk about, in particular, Nelson Maldonado Torres talks about four components to coloniality, and one was the establishment of a racial hierarchy. These things will be quite familiar to your listeners, I'm guessing. The establishment of a racial hierarchy, the establishment of nation states, the control of labor, and control of knowledge. So all those sort of four constituent parts contribute to the project of coloniality. And therefore, if we're interested in decoloniality, we must be addressing the impact of that through modernity. Probably the only other thing I would point out is coloniality is often talked about as the sort of dark underside to modernity. Right. So we talk about the sort of last 300-400 years of humanity has been the sort of real breakthrough from the Dark Ages or what preceded it. But what's not often talked about or less talked about is the sort of the impact of that on many, many groups in society throughout the globe, Indigenous peoples, the impact of the transatlantic slave trade, and so on. Yeah.
Can you give us a couple of examples and please use New Zealand? I mean, and the challenges or the problems the Maoris are facing in 2024 New Zealand that are, that just show how colonization, even if it ended, coloniality is ongoing.
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, we have a series of very interesting politics, to put it mildly. We have a conservative government that's come in with quite a radical agenda, pushing a number of anti-Maori policies. But prior to that, and we can talk about that later on. But prior to that, and sort of since the 1950s, Maori 1950s Maori moved from largely rural areas into urban localities. And since then, particularly, you've seen the sort of impact of education, social welfare system, the justice system on Maori. So we're about 18, 19% of the overall population. We're trending up. But for the last 40 years, we've been well over 50% of the prison population. And Maori women particularly are hovering around 60% of the prison population. And since the 1950s, since urbanization, we've been a large part of the prison population. And that's not going to change in a hurry. Certainly in terms of education and social mobility, we've largely filled the sort of more labouring jobs after urbanization. And as there are economic downturns, our population is the first to get hit by the impact of those economic downturns. So we're often much poorer, less educated, less healthy than what we call Pākehā New Zealanders or white people in New Zealand. And so it's in that way that coloniality has sustained itself. But probably the only other thing I should mention is, Europeans arrived here sort of in a formal way, 1840, we signed a treaty. But by about the early 20th century, and we held most of the land in 1840, by the beginning of the 20th century, large percentage of land had been alienated through a range of different mechanisms, confiscations, different mechanisms of the native land court. And so we're largely, by the early 20th century, landless. Yeah.
And that process took only about 100 years. So if you wound back time and we went to, let's say, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, 1815,
Yeah.
like back at that time, the Maori were more or less, I mean, there were not many white settlers back then.
No, where we had early settlers around the late 1700s, but they were really sort of whalers, what they call whalers and sealers. They'd pop in to hunt whales and seals and then head back. We had Americans down here in that period, and British, of course, and others. But it wasn't till sort of 1820s, 1830s that there was an increase in Europeans. But even by 1840, there was still only about 2,000 Europeans here. And by 1858, there was parity with the populations, and that's when things got really changed. 1858.
What was so you would say there was a clear window of colonization and but basically supplanting of the indigenous of Maori on the New Zealand islands.
Hmm.
That took about until when? Like, when do you think it's fair to say that we went from this proactive colonization moment into this more passive and structure maintaining
Yeah.
coloniality?
So by the 1850s, mid 1850s, I think they set up the first New Zealand Parliament and started to get an organized government. And that's in response to the increase in number of Europeans or Pākehā arriving. Yeah.
And that's all white settler parliament
Yep.
and structures, I suppose. I don't think they asked Maori to join, right?
No, not at all. And we weren't interested. We had our own social political structures, and we maintained a sort of a distance from them. A number of chiefs would say, that's for Pākehā people, and we have our own. We'll look after our own people, thanks. And chiefs are saying that right up until the end of the 19th century. Things sort of changed around the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah. But the only other sort of thing I want to point out is between about 1845 to about early 1870s, we had a series of wars basically right throughout the North Island, from the top of the North Island right down to the top of the South Island. A range of engagements with the British Army. Yeah, and French were here too.
And how let me ask it this way. How bad was the dying on the Maori side? I mean, if we compare this to what happened in North America, I mean, that was a genocide. Like, I mean, just large parts of the native population were eradicated. And some people say, like, oh, they just died of pox, and it was sickness that took them away. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what killed the people. It's just the fact of the matter was, like, a lot of people died. How was that in the experience in New Zealand? Was there large
Not
waves of
through
people dying away?
no, not through war. It was more through sickness and alienation from land. I mean, there were significant deaths from war. But pre-European war in New Zealand, it was different, right? So we'd had a series of it's what you might call more guerrilla warfare. We have a series of engagements, and because you couldn't afford large-scale losses, as soon as there was an engagement and you'd seen the sort of general trajectory of the engagement, you think, okay, we're going to back out now because it's not looking good, or you carry on and the other lot would back up. So we carried on that sort of approach to the battles with the Europeans. We wouldn't stay around to get slaughtered. And so in the Waikato Wars, for example, we would build what we call fighting pars or fighting fortifications. We'd have an engagement with the British, and then we'd leave it, move on to another spot, and then prepare for battle again. And so it's in that way we didn't sustain large losses. The other sort of thing during that period was before Europeans, it was largely hand-to-hand combat with, we didn't have muskets and so on. But muskets and cannon warfare really changed the nature of the engagements. And so we had to develop new techniques and strategies to counter that. And they did develop sort of tunnels, trenches, which were basically protect large numbers of warriors during the bombardment. And there were often occasions when Europeans thought that they'd bombed it so much that all the Maori were dead, and then they raided the fortification, only to find out that the Maori were quite fine, actually, and then countered and killed a large number of Europeans in the process.
So, would you say that the history of Maori, of the colonization of the Maori lands, is not so much one of like outright genocide as more a constant battle, and until to a certain point where then the Maori were integrated into what today is New Zealand in, well, the way it is. Is that
Yeah. I mean, I would say we've never been fully integrated in many ways, and even today, most people would consider us fully integrated, but there are large swathes of the Maori population today who are not what I would call integrated, and they've been referred to by politicians as the not the unemployed, but the underemployed, the underclass. And so I would, I've written about this in a piece that I sent you. Um, these are what I call te hapai or le damne, and Fanon called them. And there's sort of a section of Māori society through unemployment, through engagement with crime and justice system. It's meant that they've effectively been pushed out of society in many different ways. And the current government is continuing with that push, particularly against gangs.
at the same time, though, there seems to be a very strong consciousness in today's New Zealand, also among the children and children's children of the settlers of the white Europeans, that this is Maori land. I mean, your university is called the University of Canterbury, and it doesn't get much more English than Canterbury.
No, not at all.
But it has a subtitle, Te Ware Wananaga Awaitaha. But that's officially that's in the slogan, right?
Yeah.
In the
So,
emblem.
te whare wānanga o Waitaha. Yeah, there's since the 1980s, there's been a push towards sort of bilingualism within New Zealand, particularly with the language revitalisation movement, which really began around the mid-1970s, because the number of speakers left within Māoridom was down to about 5% native speakers. So there's been a big push around the language, but with that came the sort of increasing the status of the language. And so not just universities, but government departments have adopted Maori names. And it's sort of the Maori language is quite ubiquitous within New Zealand English and New Zealand society.
So
Yeah.
is it an official language? Can you demand to have your documents sent to you in Maori?
Yes, it's an official language, and we have two official languages, Te Reo Māori and sign language.
Okay.
English is not, yeah, which is um, created an angst for some locals here. I don't understand it myself, but there you go. Mm.
But so what would you say today? Like despite this remnants of like coloniality that are still
Mm.
like clearly around,
Yep,
the societal peace in New Zealand and also all of the friendships and bonds and intermarriages and so on, of which I believe that you are also an example of. Like,
yeah,
where does this leave today the social structure? And instead of having an us versus them,
yeah,
um, how's life going along, and how do you see this developing without like losing Maori
yeah,
tradition in assimilation?
yeah. So largely, we've been successful despite the sort of undermining of language and customs and knowledge and so on, through the education system and through structures of the state. We've been successful at maintaining that, and particularly over the last two or three generations of young Maori, there's been a sort of what we refer to as a renaissance. So in that sense, and it's grown stronger since the 1980s. And I guess that's why we're getting a pushback by the government today. So we've been successful at that. There is for sure a lot of integration. I mean, one of our sort of most well-known scholars of the last generation, a guy called who I studied under for a little bit, Professor Ranginui Walker, he's passed away now. He said that colonization is sorted out in the bedrooms. And so it's through intermarriages that you resist, in a way, colonization. Yeah.
And it is there of current Maori society, is there now a stronger awareness of the importance of keeping these traditions alive or even bringing them back? And how's the language doing? I mean, is it growing again?
Yeah, yeah. Particularly in the younger generation, sort of when I was a young parent, it was my generation who sent our children to our what we call the language nests, and they learned. They basically become through an education system that was completely immersed into Te Reo Māori. And so over the last 40 years, this has been quite successful. That said, there's a large number of Māori kids that don't have the opportunity to go to these types of educational initiatives. So a large number of Māori children are in what we call mainstream education. But even within mainstream education, there's a sort of awareness and appreciation of things Māori, and they sort of incorporate aspects of Māori language and culture in the mainstream system. I would say in a more tokenistic way, however.
Um, and the decoloniality process, the process of reversing these structures.
Mm,
What is currently going on that the Maori are doing in order
mm,
to, without killing the country or without killing the current like let's put it this way, the social peace. Without killing
yeah.
the social peace, how to do the decolonial process.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is an aid of decolonization, decoloniality, but through the last 30 to 40 years, we've engaged in a reparations process. So we set up 1975, set up the Waitangi Tribunal Act. So we signed a treaty with Europeans in 1840. After it was signed, it was largely ignored for about maybe 100 years. And in 1975, an act was established to say, well, actually, the Crown should honour the treaty and should start to observe it. But it wasn't until mid 1980s, about 83, 84, that the tribunal was empowered to look at historical transgressions. So since the mid 1980s, tribes have been engaged in this process of reparations where they present cases to the tribunal, and the tribunal will make recommendations, and the government would then enter into negotiations with tribes for return of land, cultural redress, return not return, but giving tribes a little bit of cash to get things started. But since then, the 1990s, the first series of these claims are really settled. Tribes have become quite wealthy. A number of tribes have become quite wealthy. There are two tribes in particular, one in the North Island and the one where I'm located in the South Island. They're particularly wealthy entities. I think between them anywhere, geez, don't quote me on this, but I think they share about between them assets of up to about $6 to $7 billion.
Okay.
So they're significant. The tribe in the South Island here in Aotahi are very powerful as a result of, prudent financial expenditure and investments and economic opportunities, but also through the reparations process. So it's in that way that tribes have been able to sort of get back in economic footing and start to influence government policy. We have tribes have relationships with the government at different levels where they begin to influence policy through formalizing the relationship with the different tribes.
And do the tribes, if we look at the state as this hierarchical structure, and on top we've got the executive, the judiciary, the legislative, and then everything else in Western society is below those, right? And it's part of the structure. Are the tribes integrated in that in New Zealand, or are they recognized as sovereign entities of their own that can take their own decisions?
Technically, they're under legislation passed by the Parliament. So there are acts set up for the establishment of entities, tribal entities, that receive the reparations and established these entities. So technically, they're actually part of the government and Crown, right? But there's certainly aspirations to what we would call tino rangatiratanga, which is what we were guaranteed in the treaty, Article 2 of the treaty. Tino rangatiratanga is really chieftainship. That was used instead of other words, but it's more akin to notions of both sovereignty and self-determination. And so, whilst we've become integrated to an extent with mainstream society, there's always been attempts, and there's still, to varying degrees, in movements towards tino rangatiratanga, self-determination or autonomy. That hasn't really necessarily been achieved, but in different spheres, it's starting to take place. Yeah,
it's highly interesting, and so in a sense, like the Maori are a good example for one particular type of trying to kind of push back against those historical injustices. And maybe can we just go back to this instance, because you've mentioned it yourself several times. That's this Treaty of 1840.
yes.
A treaty implies that at that time the UK government, the Crown, recognized the Maori as a sovereign other, as a subject on equal footing. Was that the case? And then, legally speaking, the breach of the treaty, how did that encroachment, how did that take place? I mean, obviously not in one kind of coup de force, like the way that it went for Hawaii, where suddenly there was a coup d'état, and then there was an outside force in there, and then that kind of occupied the land. And I had to talk about this with a Hawaiian scholar, Keanu Sai, the other day, and he says, like, look, we are still under occupation. We were occupied in one instance. For you, it went differently. Can you describe that?
Yeah, so actually, before 1840, we signed what was known as the Declaration of Independence in 1835, and that was really at the behest, I think, of some early settlers, basically a declaration that we're a sovereign nation here, and that was a sort of precursor to the 1840 treaty. The treaty was signed in 1840. There are two versions of it, a Māori language version and then an English version. They differ in significant ways. Over 500 chiefs signed the Maori version, and 30 chiefs signed the English version. And so part of the tribunal's task has been to work out, reconcile the differences between the two versions. But clearly, in the Maori version of the treaty, a sovereignty was acknowledged, or Tino Rangatiratanga was acknowledged, and the Crown had taken it upon them to ensure that maintained. You've got to understand that in 1840, like I said, there was only 2,000 Europeans here, and there were about 50,000 plus Maori. We were under no threat by Europeans. There was no real need to sign a treaty with the Europeans. They weren't going to invade. They had no capacity to do so. The reason why we signed the treaty is we wanted to maintain trade with Europeans. So by 1810s, Maori were jumping on ships going over to Sydney, even heading over to England, largely to begin trade. And famously, there's a northern war chief called Hongi Hika, travelled to England to get muskets, and that was his main purpose for going, was to get muskets. He sought to meet the monarchy at the time. They declined. In England, he returned to Sydney and he bought a whole bunch of muskets in Sydney, then returned to Aotearoa, and then engaged on a sort of 10-year warpath against tribes that had previously inflicted defeats on his tribe. So
overall, it's not a story of like actually. It's not one of these moments when the Europeans came over and just said like this is our land, terra nullius, as they did in other places. It's more it's so far away that in a sense even the Europeans didn't have a sense of like let's go and take it. It's more like let's do whatever we can, and then it organically grew into what it was.
yes, so they did basically acquire most of the South Island where I am now through notion of terra nullius, because it was more sparsely populated. So they engaged in a series of agreements with local chiefs to acquire large blocks of land in return for what they called reserves. 10% of the land was set aside for the local tribe. These reserves weren't honoured, and that was the basis of the claim against the Crown from the tribe down here. But certainly in the North Island, there were large sections of the North Island which were no-go zones for Pākehā people. So the King Country is not named after the King of England. It's named after the Maori King, and he basically said, no Europeans. It's what we call the Aokati line, and they weren't to enter into that region. So, Europeans did arrive in large numbers, and but largely centred in sort of around Auckland, Wellington, New Plymouth, and then spread out from there. And that's where you get the conflict over land,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and that's where then the larger wars between the Maori and the Europeans started in the 1870s, 80s, 90s.
Yeah, the early wars in the 1840s in the North were really around disagreements between relationships set up between some chiefs and the Europeans, and it was really a squabble over trade. But the later wars from the 1860s, 1850s were really about land and encroachment on Maori land. Yeah.
That's fascinating. What's the international relations level? Like the interactions between Maori and other nations, other states, with the Chinese, the Americans, well, I don't know, Hawaii, like other Pacific islands.
So maybe over the last, since the 1980s, there's been a strong international Indigenous sort of movement, and in particular, we've forged relationships with brothers and sisters from Australia, with Hawaiians, with Native Americans from Turtle Island, largely Anglo-colonized nations, because we can all speak English and work things out. Right? So we forged relationships with them and have been inspired by the different movements from those parts of the world, and we've had a contribution to the things they've developed in their part of the world. In terms of broader sets of relationships, we don't. They're a little bit more patchy, but we do have historically relationships. So with China, early Chinese were here in the sort of mid 19th century to speculate for gold. And there have been a large number of Chinese families in Maori communities who have been accepted and are still there today, particularly in the Waikato region where the Maori monarchy is established. There are descendants of the Maori monarchy who are also Chinese. There are intermarriage between the two. I used to live in a place called Aotahi, and there are old Chinese families there, 6, 7 generations, and still there today. So there's sort of relationships with different groups of people. The other sort of one to point out is the relationship with the Japanese emperor, which we never talked about when we met. But one of the healers from here, a guy called Wiremu Portikirātana, was sent. This is our story. I'm not sure how it's told in Japan. He was a healer, well-known healer and a leader of a religious movement here. And he went to Japan in about 1920s and spent some time and met with the emperor. And one of the stories is that he healed the emperor there and forged a relationship with the Japanese emperor. Also, there are later on more recent relationships. Naitahu down here, the leader who really was the foreleader of the attempt for reparations and to establish the tribal bureaucracy, a guy called Tātipine O'Regan. He had a relationship with a really wealthy Japanese businessman, and it was because of a loan of this wealthy Japanese businessman that the tribals were really able to fund some of their earlier moves to put their case forward to the crown. So there are all sorts of relationships globally. I'm sure there'll be many, many more. But we've always been people who have moved and been curious about the world, if I might say it that way.
Do you think that the Maori population and that experience of colonization and coloniality now, and not just among the Maori, but also among the white population, the European descendants, that
Yep.
this is going to impact the way that New Zealand as a state will conduct its foreign policy? Because it seems to me that it would indicate that there's more than just geopolitical reasons for New Zealand to be very cautious when it comes to the way that the Pacific is developing at the moment, and I'm of course talking about this the war that the US is talking up with China, and that actually everybody in the region is very much afraid, including Australians and the Indonesians and so on. You go up and everybody is scared of what happens when these two hammers come together. But how do you think that the local political situation will influence these foreign policy decisions of the current government or of the governments in general?
So locally, we've had significant influence on sort of both political life, economic life, and domestically. Maori influence is quite ubiquitous. But in terms of foreign policy, that's a different story. I think New Zealand foreign policy is largely determined by historical relationships with the sort of empires of firstly Great Britain, but by default with the US now. We have close relations with Australia, Great Britain, and New Zealand. And historically, Maori have sort of, if not fallen into line, have become part of that arrangement. So, for example, World War I, World War II, we sent battalions to both of those wars. We sent over 6,000 men to the World War II. And
But Maori battalion or a New Zealand
Maori
battalion?
battalion. Yeah,
Really?
Maori battalion.
Oh, wow.
And the battalions were organized by tribes. And so they sent 6,000 plus men to war. and they fought in mostly North Africa, Crete, and in Italy, and Turkey, actually.
Well,
And so we've always been a part of that. Maori have always been a significant part of the Defence Force, and so that way we've played a part in those global affairs. But I was at a army camp a few years back, and the army is really facing difficulties recruiting soldiers. And I checked the numbers on Maori ethnicity in the New Zealand Army, and the Maori engagement or participation in the New Zealand Army has really dropped off from maybe over the last 20 years. And which, part of me is happy about that. I don't think we should be going to fight other people's wars. And I'm certainly not interested in us being dragged into a war with China. But the extent to which we could influence our foreign policy on that is quite a different matter. I mean, I do think the tribes have significant influence politically, but have chosen not to use it for global, international political level, but more at the local level, which I've been somewhat disappointed at, actually. Yeah.
well, what would your vision be? Like, could there be more Maori clout in the foreign policy making world of New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, I do think tribes and, I've made an argument that tribes have significant leverage now, both at a political level, economic level, and we should be using that leverage to start to shape conversations around foreign policy. And with the significant changes which you've sort of alluded to and the political shifts going on, which are profound, we should be starting to engage in conversations about that and shaping that. New Zealand has, since the 1980s, has tried to tread a more of a sort of neutral position, particularly since the French blew up a ship in our port. I don't know if you're aware of that. Oh,
No, what was that episode?
the Rainbow Warrior affair, Greenpeace ship, and French sent in a couple of um, uh, some of their sort of undercover people, and they bombed a ship in one of the ports in Auckland. The Rainbow Warrior killed a number of people. It was a bit of a scandal. We found them, put them in prison, but there was a deal made later on. They were returned to France. But since the 1980s and sort of the fears of the impact of nuclear war, New Zealand has tried to tread more of a neutral path. We've said to the Americans, we won't accept your nuclear submarines or ships into our ports, and that was sort of a bit of a speed bump in the relationship. But I think they've gotten used to that. And but over the last little while, there's been more of a tendency, I think, to realign ourselves with these big powers. And recently, New Zealand government, we're part of the Five Eyes arrangement, which is a sort of basically spies from five nations sharing data with one another. Actually, some of them are spying on their own nations, on the other parts of the relationship, because the governments can't spy on their own people, so we get our partners to spy on each other. But the recent AUKUS announcement, which was another relationship, I'm not entirely sure of the details, but that's sort of another way in which we've been entrenched, further enmeshed in that set of relationships with the US, Great Britain, Australia, and so
Right.
on.
Right. So
Yeah.
overall, the siding of New Zealand is pretty clear, and the Maori factor in that sense is not an opposing factor, I take it.
It doesn't have that much of an effect. I think it could be much more.
Right.
And particularly given sort of, our biggest trading partner at the moment, and has been for quite some time, is China. Over 30% of our trade is done with China. We'd be shooting ourselves in the foot if we're jumping into a war with China. And China know that, and they've sent signals. Um, and the Labour government was a little bit more cautious. This government's been a little bit more forthright in pushing back to China.
Are there pushes from the United States for New Zealand to kind of to impose tariffs on China and so on?
No, not at the moment. We're a small player. We're at the bottom of the world, and a small player relatively, a population of 5 million. The US has turned in on itself, uh, except for imposing tariffs and going to wars. They've sort of become quite inward looking. And so particularly under Trump, he wasn't interested in anything to do with New Zealand. Certainly during the Biden administration, there wasn't a lot of conversations and dialogue going on beyond at the level of diplomats and so on, but nothing nationally.
Right, right, right. I know I find this quite interesting also because, and I told you when we met here in Tokyo, right, a while ago, like there's this idea of the Europeans and the Americans too, that colonization is a evil of the past.
Mm.
It's something like feudalism. We know it wasn't good. We know there was people who suffered, but it is long over.
Yep.
And therefore it has no impact today. Whereas, like, if you flip it around and you ask the natives of those lands, either in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, in Australia, New Zealand, they say
Yep.
like, no, 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 it's a completely different story. And of course, it's continuing, and you even have a word for that, like coloniality, right? But it seems to me that we are at a somewhat in like special point now where it's even possible for indigenous people to actually bring that up, bring themselves into the political process, at least in some areas, while at the same time, a completely different colonization process in Israel is going on with even the genocidal extermination of the local population. Um, how do you make sense of this? That we still have the rawest, most cruel version of colonization going on in front of our eyes, including a
Yep.
genocide, while on the other hand, like parts of the globe are in a not in a reverse gear, but let's call it in a healing phase of
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
tragedy.
Yeah. I mean, Maori leaders have always been suspicious of Pākehā leaders, and so one of our most famous prophets, Te Kōti Rikirangi, who was really prominent in the 19th century, he urged our people to maintain suspicion of Europeans, despite some of the warm gestures they may have made. And I think it's really important to maintain a dosy health of suspicion in relationship. And with regards to these types of relationships. At the end of the day, these are political arrangements, whatever concessions are made, and they're not necessarily because of the goodwill or the sort of pure heart of the other side. The gains that we've made are on the back of significant protest, resistance, and pressure put on the government, and also leveraging of international movements. So, in a sense, these things are not things that were given to us. They had to be fought for, and any further gains are always going to have to be fought for. So, it's in that sense, whilst things might appear to the outside world as sort of harmonious, we're working things out. Behind the scenes, there's a significant amount of tension, and it flares up every now and then. You know. I mean, one example of that, it's not necessarily a Maori Pākehā government thing, but the 1981 Springbok tour, which really split the country down the middle. That was a sort of most level of violence and protest that we'd seen in a long time, 1981, in support of uh, the anti-apartheid movement and Nelson Mandela, but it split the country down the middle. So
And
these things are always have to be you have to constantly fight for.
and now when it
And
comes to Gaza, how is
yeah,
the popular opinion?
um, so largely, if you speak to the Maori on the street, we see ourselves in the Palestinian people in the sense that we see the situation they're facing is something that we've faced in the past, and we face a different face of that face, if you like. So there's a significant amount of empathy and support for Palestinian. So largely, if you speak to the Maori on the street, we see ourselves in the Palestinian people in the sense that we see that the situation they're facing is something that we've faced in the past, and we face a different face of that face, if you like. So there's a significant amount of empathy and support for Palestinian, the model for indigenous people throughout the world. And
Wow.
yeah, it was crazy. It was sort of been flipping the world upside down. Um, but largely Maori support is with the Gaza people. In the recent protest, which was probably the largest protest we've seen in this country, it was in opposition to the Treaty of Waitangi Principles Bill, which is a really radical proposal. We had over 100,000 people turn up at Parliament that day, which is the largest single protest in our country's history. And there are big portions of what there's a young activist group called Asians for Tino Rangatiratanga. They were there, significant group of local Palestinian populations there to support the movement, and also a large number of Pākehā people and Pacifica brothers and sisters were there too. And so the movement is sort of pulling people together in that sense. Mm.
That's encouraging to hear. Um, Garrick, if people want to read more from you or more from the research that your institute does or the publications, where should they go?
They could just jump on Google and put my name in and come to send me an email. Happy to share.
Okay.
Yeah.
Everybody, if you want to reach out and connect, please talk to Garrick Cooper. He's a great specialist and mind, and also like somebody deeply involved in Maori political circles because he studies them. So, Garrick Cooper, thank you very much for your time today.
Good night, Pascal.